Black coffee.
This is the Exchange Coffee Podcasting Network, where coffee people talk to coffee people about coffee and things coffee adjacent. This episode of X-Files is brought to you by Kavoya Specialty Coffee, where coffee is always a collaborative voyage. Welcome to the X-Files, podcast from the past with Mark Inman and Todd Mackey. Down the stairs, around the corner, down the long hall, and through the double doors, you'll find the archives for the Exchange Coffee podcast. Episodes from 2018 and 2019, before we had a studio. We're going back through the archives and improving the sound quality where we can, re-recording introductions, and merging two-part episodes into a single episode. Episode 4 of the X-Files is from episodes 17 and 19 of The Exchange from 2019, The Coffee Roaster and Customer Training. And now, here they are, Mark and Todd.
So, like, zooming out, let's shape it up from 30,000 feet.
Yeah.
Give me your, 3 to 4 top, questions or concerns that you would hit any growing roaster with as it pertains to customer training, whether that's, program perspective or what have you. I have a handful of, main bullets, and then we'll cut it up and we'll move the discussion from there.
Well, I think the main points that I would bring in early would be knowing who you're training. I think the biggest mistake that roasters make is they try to lump all of their wholesale clients into a group training session. And the type of training that you would offer somebody who owns a restaurant is going to be very different than somebody who owns an actual coffee house or a bakery, because the type of service you'd be doing, the type of training you'd be doing is a totally different focus. Secondly, I would say having your programs very well thought out and simplified, cleaned up, edited. Nobody is going to sit through a training that is overly wonky and too overly detailed. To have it very, very streamlined. And then later on, get into it about the idea of, do you charge for these things? Do you offer it for free? And the type of staffing that you throw towards a training program.
Sure. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So we're fairly well overlapped. I think I certainly have I call it treatment or the communication style.
Sure.
Are you overly stuffy and technical, the sort of lab approach versus informal and just more practical. I have certainly the distribution mechanism. Is it a training center? Are you out and about? Obviously, again, to follow up with you have different types of clients with different needs.
Yeah.
And I have two that sort of take, I think, your third and run, but might kind of vary this a little bit. One I have is, standards, your development, whether that's something that is industry correlating or sort of unique to yourself. And there's a lot of different examples out there in the marketplace that we can talk about. Sure. And then, of course, a very critical piece, and this one I'm personally super passionate about, having been a trainer in a number of different capacities, starting at the roaster level and in the roasting space, is team structure and how you approach the part of your team or parts of your team and how they approach each other. To create a successful training program, because it is a high value, high demand part of the business. And I think, unfortunately, and to their own detriment, a lot of roasters don't necessarily look at this as critical as it is when it comes to, what type of, value they put on these roles, what type of support they deliver, and
Do you think that roasters still believe that today? I mean, it's gotten very competitive out there. It seems like that's the one thing you have to do now. It's become your baseline is a very strong training program.
Of course, yeah, and let's start there. So let's talk about the team structure or the role of the trainer. In my mind, this is. This is a part of your generative business team, your sales team, your out front lines. I think this entered as you have your salespeople who are closing sales, and then you hand them off to account managers and or customer trainers, and this took like a secondary stage. I'm not arguing that roasters don't put enough value on having the trainer. What I'm trying to suggest is that I don't think a lot of people really recognize and then, compensate for just how tiresome this role is.
Oh,
this is,
yeah.
Going back to when I was training for a roaster, I mean, this was one of the most demanding jobs in terms of preparation, right? Just like you brought up at the gate, you cannot go into a customer's cafe or, any, training lab with a variety of folks. You can't sell a course in the space this day and age without being well prepared, have, stylized and branded resources, have like a backed up position on, your brewing techniques and standards. I mean, there's a lot of development and, research and development, you could say, that goes into this. But there's also, a huge amount of fatigue in setting the space, administering the classes, the demand on communication, the emotional labor involved in trying to, tickle every attendee who's there. And then add to that when you are doing this as a wholesale trainer, you have this added piece of like, what is most typically, at least in my experience, and certainly I think it hopefully has gotten better for people who are operating in this space. But you have plenty of people who are mandated to be there. They have to go. It's part of their training as they take on a job. They may take this seriously or not.
Right.
You have the objective of increasing the quality of the coffee for your employer. And you have your different success metrics, whether defined or not, often less than defined. And you're going out and you're being forced to kind of engage and excite this really varied and sort of like loosely held together, audience. And it's exhausting and challenging, and you're doing like a fantastic amount of physical setup and then cleanup and breakdown, and it's a role that I feel like gets very little recognition for those aspects. And then on top of it, it becomes one of those things. Think of a great example of a coffee company with a world-class training program is Counterculture, right?
Right.
But think of the amount of inputs, that are going into one of their training centers for the calendar they're keeping each week. I mean,
Sure.
It's just unbelievable. And so in my opinion, those roles should be absolutely at the the top end of their compensation structures and benefits for how they're engaging their markets around sales, because this is just a huge and critical engagement piece that keeps their customers coming back.
Right. Right.
And again, to reduce it to 4 words: high value, high fatigue. This is something that I think a lot of companies have to think proactively about. Well, how do we literally monetize this for our trainers? And then also, how do we keep them feeling excited and engaged when, a significant percentage often of their audience is not necessarily as high on what they're putting out there as they are,
Yeah, but I do think that when I was, doing trainings back in the day, it was something that you were like trying to get the account to do, to learn how to do these things. I was feeling like more of I'm begging you to pick up my standards. And I think that today, a training program, I think that 2 things should be going on. One is it's a real opportunity for a coffee company that is adequately resourced, because this is not a cheap thing to get into. It's something that could set your brand apart from everybody around you by the quality of training or the attention to detail that you are insisting upon. And I think it's, I thought about, Blue Bottle here in the Bay Area when they were first starting. They had all these demands on a wholesale client. You had to use this type of espresso machine. You had to brew using their pour-over brewer. You had to complete training before they'd even sell you a pound of coffee. It actually establishes a standard that the account then the dynamic shifts to, I need to learn this because I want to have this brand. It's like bars that used to serve Guinness. You had to go through so much technical training to pour the Guinness correctly, or they would not sell you the kegs of beer. Now, I don't know if that's still going on. This is just something that I knew existed. I think it's an opportunity to really set the bar high, have a consistent training program. And now, if you've seen out there, Todd, the master class, these online courses, you could, Thomas Keller and the various directors, you could listen to their theory on how they do what they do. Coffee's not that far from doing a thing like that. But I think you can really go very, very high concept with this if you have somebody good and monetize it. And it's not, I think the shift that needs to happen is we're not giving you this for free. This costs money, but this is something that is going to separate your business or make your coffee program a success or a failure. And if it's a failure, we want nothing to do with you. And it puts the customer in a very different position than, hey, we got these trainings if you guys want to take advantage of them, because then that's like a throwaway, and they put as much energy into it as you did pitching it, which is this afterthought and kind of a plea to, please participate to not make us look terrible when you guys are brewing our product.
Totally, yeah. And I think this gets into how you distribute, how you opt to distribute.
Yeah.
The whole, if-then question is huge.
Right.
You need to take this course to get our coffee. This is a requirement for your key team members, or, we have to graduate your bar manager, by such and such a time frame to set up as an account.
Or even certified. You need to be certified to serve our product.
Totally. But in that case, this gets back to, the question we raise about standards.
Right.
Do you correlate to SCA standards and best practices from an industry standpoint?
Yeah.
Are you more, let's say, focused on your own best practices, for example, setting your recipes and communicating essentially in more direct ways how to brew a particular coffee?
Right.
Think of the famous espresso blends for some of the bigger specialty roasters. Hey,
Sure.
This is how this particular coffee is best presented. Those things need to be defined and they need to be codified. And for sure, if you're going to be, putting out a high value program that you're demanding is attended and engaged, this better be a program that, first and foremost, that speaks to different types of learners,
right.
Audio learners, visual learners, kinetic learners. These are all considerations. Any trainer who's thinking big picture is going to be thinking not only, the old saying, teachers teach how they learn, right? If I, learn visually, I'm going to load packets full of pictures, maybe use AV and, be acting with my hands and, doing this whole thing. Well, if you're a good trainer, if trainer's worth their salt, they're going to be thinking practically and how to engage learners of all types, and they should be.
Right.
The other question around team, just to not get off this main point too soon, but comes into how do you create cohesion in a team? And when you start talking about companies that are growing and having to serve a large and diversified wholesale base, and or companies that have outposts in different cities and different sub-markets, there has to be some type of clear hierarchical, for lack of a better concept, chain of command around, who's right? Right. We always joke in the Q program as instructors, well, eventually someone just has to be right, and in the case of the Q, the instructor gets to say, well, this is where we land together,
right.
Full stop, right?
Right.
And in the case of a training program, there needs to be, it can't just be, well, today this coffee tasted great at this, ratio, and so if I were there, I can change things to brew, XYZ willy-nilly of any protocol. And I think the companies that are most successful, they have distilled their programs into, physical resources and set, regularly revised programs and actual resources, manuals, teaching materials, etc. But they're also able to create cohesion across multiple locations, whether that's out in the field at different customers and or in different teaching labs, by having this type of cooperation amongst their team. It's not just, hey, I'm a great basketball player, I'm just going to show up and shoot the ball and you take a look at what I'm doing.
Right.
It's, we believe that coffee, and our coffees more particularly, are best brewed this way, and here is how to do it.
Right.
That way they essentially are able to, create a real point of view, and in particular for their brand everywhere that it's seen, which is, again, I always default when it comes to customer training to Counterculture, because they've just done such an awesome job in such a widespread way. Not to only pass along praise and respect there, but
sure.
There's a number of great examples.
Oh yeah.
But to shift gears, we get into, and we've sort of already, just by engaging this whole kind of wider team approach and talking about some of the aspects of the challenges of training as a team. We've talked about distribution, and I think that one of the biggest macro questions is, are you doing this on site at your roastery in your own training center,
right,
per se? Or are you going to your customers and essentially trying to get the attention of their staff while they're also engaging their customers? Which, if you've spent time as a trainer and you've ever had to do this, it is the worst type of work. No. I mean, you are in your own personal hell trying to get it done. So maybe you could wrap a little bit on the benefits of training centers or the lab approach,
right,
and how you looked at it when you were, in the wholesale roasting space.
Yeah, I mean, we did a training center because we sold specific equipment that we used with our coffees and our customers use. So it was the same equipment that they would have in their establishment. So if they were brewing, they used the FECO brewers. If they were doing, espresso training, they would be on Nuovo Simonelli's and vice, and on down the line. So there was nothing different there. The only time we did stuff different was when, Clover just, wanted to do a demo for Northern California, and we offered up our lab to do it. That was an experience to look at a piece of equipment that most people had only heard about and had the opportunity to go through a training, but that was not a part of our normal training program. We certainly in the early days went into customers' establishments and tried to do training, and like you said, it is an utter nightmare to try to do that. If it's during work hours, it's horrible. If it's off hours, the staff cannot wait to get out of there. They don't want to be there because it's, they're on the clock, but they're done for the day mentally. And they don't want to sit there and steam milk for 2 hours and, brew batch after batch after batch. They just don't want to do it. So I always, when I had the resources to do so, I built at first a small training room in our building, and then it expanded. And especially when we started selling equipment, we would have an array of our, product line of what we were both selling to customers as well as placing when that was going on in our area, placing equipment. It was that type of, they would know the equipment that they were using. And I'm a large fan of that. I do think the challenge there becomes when you have a company, again, like Counterculture, who started expanding, or Batdorf and Bronson, who went from Olympia, Washington down to Atlanta. All of a sudden you have to build a second center, a second roastery. It's all of a sudden this gets to be very expensive to continue to do this as your company expands. I think of Intelligentsia the same way. They went from Chicago to LA to New York, and now you're managing this network of training centers, and you can't exactly use the same trainer for each center because you have simultaneous trainings going on, so you have to hire more staff that are qualified teachers. You just can't have, like you said earlier, just because you're a barista doesn't mean you know how to teach, and doesn't mean you know how to impart what you know onto somebody who doesn't know this stuff. So you have to really vet these trainers. And in my, what I would have done, as I had the company, was hire talent, like real talent, somebody who had won the Brewers, championship, the Brewers Cup, or somebody who had won the World Barista Championship. Then when you're charging for these programs, people are coming there to see a name that they know or a name they understand. There's an ability to monetize this that makes it worthwhile for the trainer that you're hiring, and makes it worthwhile for the client who feels like they're getting an incredible value for their money to learn from somebody who's deemed to be the best in the industry at that given time.
True. Yeah, I think, that brings us into the question of how do you best monetize this, or, what are the options, I guess we could say.
Yeah.
And I think, you see different folks playing to different ends where, some of the companies are doing enough direct-to-consumer business where there are trainings that mimic their wholesale training offerings that are sold, through web registration for, regular classes. This might even be something that is billed out to a wholesale customer and maybe netted to zero on any given invoice. Maybe it's a credit back or some sort of allowance, like you said earlier, to keep the account in good standing. I guess I'm curious, from your experience, what have you seen, and what do you think are the strongest ways to communicate that value to the customer? Because I think still the expectation for most bigger accounts is that training is a value add.
Right.
We always joke out this way because, old school coffee, pre-third wave specialty, it was assumed that you got free equipment with your wholesale roasted coffee, right?
And it's still the case in many markets out there.
For sure.
Yeah.
But we always joke, in specialty, training is the new equipment, right? Where most people think, well, I'm going to have to buy a nice La Marzocco machine. I might get a deal, but in general, the training is the value at, hey, well, we have so-and-so who is a celebrated and decorated barista who's going to come in and train you, or we have this program that's built on, X, Y, and Z standardized, brewing methodology, and we're going to come in and support you in this way because maybe, this is not something you're as comfortable with as an owner or operator in imparting into your team. I guess I'm curious, what ways have you seen, this value communicated? Because at the end of the day, most roasters still are not expecting their, primary wholesale customers to actually be cutting a check for these classes, right? How have you seen this communicated out to them to where they don't take advantage of it and their team isn't just not showing? Because, again, I've lived that life as a trainer.
Sure.
I just cannot communicate how disappointing it feels, even if your own company is valuing you and taking care of you, so on and so forth. There's just no feeling worse than, oh, hey, my 2:00 didn't show up. Yes, don't tie this back to me being late to the episode tonight. It has nothing to do with that.
No. I think that, I think that when you do free training, you get the value of that is as much as you're charging, which is zero. It's the same thing with giving away free equipment. The customer never values that equipment, and they abuse it. They don't maintain it because they think, I'll just get another free one. It will just keep coming. And it's when you shift that. The only way I can compare it is that, in the Bay Area here, San Francisco, it was, hey, we want to be your wholesaler. Okay, what do you got? We're going to give you a brewer, a grinder. Okay, but the competitors offered me a free espresso machine. Then you start doing the math like, that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't pencil out. And everybody was ratcheting up the free equipment, but it was never good equipment, and the customer never took care of it. And then to get out of that, we basically sat down with the customer and did the math. I'm charging you X amount of dollars for wholesale. I can charge you this much less because if I have to buy an espresso machine, buy a grinder, buy this to give you for free, then I have to make up for that. This is a business at the end of the day. I'm not a charity or I'm not an NGO.
Yeah, there is no free lunch.
Right.
Really,
so
when
it was, I'll
reduce
reduce your wholesale costs, but you'll buy this equipment and we'll train you how to use it properly, but it's good equipment and your staff will want to do well with it. And then that shifted the value proposition. Now, I think, who has been successful with doing this is a company like Intelligentsia, who had, world champion baristas, and it was more, you're lucky to even get the opportunity to be trained here. You're not going to be late and you're not going to not show, because you will never, be allowed to grace these doors again. And they did not have that problem. People were lining up to take their trainings, and their wholesale program was very vibrant back in the day. And I think it's because they invested a lot in talent, and that talent was known industry-wide. It wasn't just, they were the big fish in the small pond of their market. They were known, internationally. So the investment paid off for them. Now, I don't know if they ever charged for this training. I don't know that. My assumption is that they did, because the quality of the training was quite good. The people that were in charge of the training program, when I was aware of them watching them closely, these people were also instructors in the SCAA at the time, and they were practicing their chops through the SCAA on instructing that they were taking back to their own company. And their investment in their training centers were top notch. I mean, it looked like a functioning cafe when you went into these training centers, and it was, a lot of investment went into that. But it worked for them. Now, I think if you're a smaller roaster and you don't have the budget, you're not going to be able to compete at that high of a level. But then make your actual coffee program mirror what you have the money to do. So, a prime example of that was I personally, even though I was the chair of the World Barista Championship, I was not altogether sold on the idea that everybody needed an espresso machine in their establishment, especially restaurants. Because the argument that I would have made at the time is that there are a lot of coffee houses in any given town at this point. I mean, Providence, for example, where you are. I mean, how good, when you go to a restaurant, a non-Italian, let's just say, you go to a regular old restaurant and they have an espresso machine, how good do you think that drink is going to be at that establishment? Probably not very good. And meanwhile, next door, you're going to get a fantastic espresso or cappuccino, because that's their focus. That's what they do great. Mm. So what I would argue at the time, what I was pushing to restaurants, because I didn't want to get that deep into espresso, and B, I didn't have a great trainer at the time, was, here in Sonoma County with wines and seasonal food and seasonal eating, was offer a seasonal tableside French press menu. You can never go wrong. Nobody's going to ever get up and walk out because they can't get a cappuccino if that's being offered. You could rotate the coffee so they're always in season. You could tell the same story about that coffee that you're telling about your wines on your wine list, or your, or whatever other, top-end rums or beers that you're selling, or whatever you're into. You can have the same story for your waiters. It's easy to do. It's easy to do correctly, and it is a good profit center. Whereas, an espresso machine for a restaurant, it's, an espresso machine, a grinder, the tamper, the knockbox, all of a sudden you've got 6 feet of dedicated counter space just to serve a cup of coffee, versus a hot water tower, a grinder, and some French presses, and you're good to go with a very good program if you teach them right, or Chemexes, or whatever you want to do. So I was pushing that, and we were able to train around that seasonally throughout the year. Like now we're dealing with centrals, and this is how our brewing parameters are when we deal with these coffees. And they were mirroring the Gold Cup standard, but it was still changing the brewing parameters for the time of the year. It was easy to train it. It was easy to standardize it. It was easy for the staff to understand and grasp it and feel successful at it. Therefore, it was a successful training program. Versus my early espresso training programs were a nightmare. I mean, I had to call in Ellie Hudson to come help us because I was like, look, I'm drowning over here. I need some help. And she was able to help me craft a very good program. But at that time, I still, predominantly I was dealing with restaurants here in the wine country and bakeries. And espresso was deemed as you had to have, but I was on a mission to talk people out of it and getting into the idea of the myriad of great, flavor opportunities that were there for brewed coffee.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I feel like to train on a steep and release method like French press, or to do a particular drip method like Chemex or something like that.
Yeah,
you're essentially teaching it once. It's easy to communicate within the team, when you're not there, and then you're communicating updates to recipes when coffees change,
yes.
Right? And you're also talking about all of these things that are, in that context, ultimately aesthetically pleasing because they may happen tableside, or you may leave a timer and the French press on the table, and it's really, kind of cute and amazing, and you plunge the French press and you get to pour it for your guest and then for yourself. And, I mean, there's just so many things around that, but through the lens of training, you're absolutely right. I mean, you're simplifying in such a massive way. And you're making it ultimately sustainable. I just couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
And, you're recognizing your audience in saying, yeah, there's a ton of turnover, even in the very best of restaurants.
Yes.
I mean, there's a lot of staff. And then on top of that, there's a lot of transient staff, that are going to have to pick this up. And can you sustain for a 10-pound a week, restaurant client, even though the optics are amazing that you're in that restaurant? The economics do not support being out there every 2 weeks to support their staff, pulling, face-melting shots of espresso. So I do think, people like yourself who got the ball rolling in that direction, the market has listened by now.
Yeah.
Though you probably didn't enjoy it too much at the time.
Oh, I hated it. And I had to have outright arguments with my customers. And one particular example, this was a very top-end wine country restaurant, and they called me in to do the coffee service, and they had the espresso machine where the bartender at the bar, and the restaurant, was serving espresso via the bar. And I said, that's a terrible idea. Get rid of that thing. It's an albatross around your neck, and you're going to regret it. And the guy said, you have no idea what you're talking about. And I said, okay, Let me give you this. I'm gonna give me 4 days, and I'm gonna come back and prove to you that I'm right and you're wrong. And there's gonna be no doubt about it in your mind. And then we can talk about the program that I'm actually suggesting. And so Friday night, I went into this restaurant with a friend of mine. Walked up to the bar, went to the bartender, and he said, "What can I get for you?" And I said, "I want 12 mochas." And he looked at me like, "You're out of your mind, right?" And I'm like, "No, I need 12 mochas. I got my friends over there." And he's like, I don't have time for that right now. Because why? He's going to sell mochas at $5 a glass when he could bang out, 10 martinis at half the time and make a lot more money. The bartender is dictating what that business is going to sell and not sell. And then I had recorded this conversation. And the bartender got fired. No, I'm just kidding. He didn't get fired. But I brought it back to the owner. I said, see, even your staff won't embrace this program. There's nothing you can do to force feed this. It's not necessary. Unless you take that espresso machine and put it in the kitchen and have a dedicated, it's usually the busboy or somebody, that's trained to do this. There's examples like the Slanted Door restaurant in San Francisco that hired a head barista at $60,000 a year base just to manage their espresso program. That's a very unusual story in the scheme of things and how a restaurant operates. But outside of that, if you're not going to dedicate yourself to doing espresso, get out of it. It's not necessary. And if you have it away from you, your life gets so much easier as a restaurateur. Now, you're not going to get away with this in a bakery or a cafe. You have to have that, espresso as a part of your offering, or you're going to be in trouble. I think, with Need Donuts, you guys don't do espresso, correct?
Yeah, it's filter coffee
Yeah,
only.
which works with that. I think, no, General Porpoise Donuts in Seattle had espresso. I've seen this elsewhere where they have not done that. Obviously, some of the bigger chains don't offer that. But I think you can get away with it in the donut world because a donut and a cup of brewed coffee is probably the match made in heaven. It's the best combo of flavors you can get out there. But if you're a full-on bakery or a full-on coffee house, you have to have espresso, and then that ratchets up your need as a wholesaler to up your training program and your training game.
Yeah, but this brings us down an interesting path, which is taking the restaurant world as it relates to filter coffee and or versus espresso.
Right.
And you have to look at cafes, and roasters need to evaluate their wholesale customers. Or at least instruct them. And this is sort of a fork in the discussion, so I'll tease out one point and then we could migrate to the other. But first and foremost, the idea that a great cafe serves coffee by, a myriad of brewing methods, I'm excited because in recent years that has become less and less a thing. And I couldn't, be more thankful to see that happen, because in the reality from a training perspective, that's just totally unsustainable.
Yeah.
And how many times have you gone into a cafe and asked for the siphon pot, and the poor barista on shift is looking at you like, is there any way I could convince you not to do that? Right. And so the idea,
and thank God that trend is come and gone. That was just an abomination.
For sure. It's
visually
painful, but
awesome. Granted, it's always a showstopper, and
for sure,
but it is a nightmare to have as a program in your.
But when it's done well, it's amazing, and it's so cool to try something new.
Yeah.
But it's such an unfair position to put a staff member in, to be expected that, you're going to have to do this once a week. And let's say you work 3 or 4 shifts, so maybe your bell gets rung like once a month.
Yeah.
And someone asks for this thing, and they're expecting it to be the best cup of coffee they've ever made. It's by far the most expensive, and you're there just sweating, saying, "Oh my God, please, let's just hope this goes well. This thing hasn't been dusted in weeks," and and that's the experience. So I'm so excited to see that go, because, to me, this brings up like challenges in actually training effectively someone who's going to touch and engage a piece of equipment so seldom. But also it brings up this aspect which you've expressed in your time engaging these restaurants from the roaster perspective. The idea that you also are essentially training in a consultative manner.
Right.
You're selling that way, and you're constantly engaging people saying, well, think about this instead of that. And, have you tried to, put this together for your program? And wouldn't it be great if, we lined up this way? But, training is one of the hugest ways, what you really have as a point of view as a company, your whole concept of coffee and how it should end up in a cup.
Right.
This is one of the ways that you can actually make that be and help your customers understand and communicate in material, what your company is all about. So I think that is another reason there is a huge value on your trainer roles, and why they're absolutely salespeople in the most direct and meaningful way. And why you should really, think beyond just, hey, this coffee's good, great job, you nailed it on accident, and I'm done here and I'm out. There's a huge value to saying, yeah, we could talk all day about siphon pot coffee, or, Chemex in this case, or whatever it might be. But, you're not going to serve any of that here. In fact, we've decided collaboratively that we're going to brew coffee this one way, maybe even by, automatic filter.
Sure.
Or, something like this. And this is exactly why. And here are the critical steps. This is what we're going to do to make the best possible coffee here. And this is exactly why we're going to do it.
The point of view piece is key. And you hit it on the head. Is as a coffee roaster, you need a point of view of what your brand is about. And if you feel suckered into a shop saying, hey, we saw this cool siphon thing at a show and we're going to do it here. The ability for you to make a cohesive argument why that's a bad idea for their business and for your business and why you don't want to participate is key. And secondly, a great training program or a successful, if you've been doing this correctly, you're getting something that's repeatable, that's embraceable, that people that are not your staff are embracing and replicating over and over to their client base, where it actually has consistency involved. If you have some wonky, if you're doing siphon training, the odds of it being repeated every time exactly the way you train are going to be close to zero because there's too many moving parts to do it correctly.
For sure. Well, let's shift gears here and let's talk about communication style, or kind of how a small and growing roaster might market or present their training program. I think if you break it up into two main scans or channels, you have like the lab kind of mad scientist approach, or you have the more like relaxed, informal. This is us workshopping, making a cup of coffee approach. And I guess my main question here is not, what's best, because obviously there is no best. It's really about what's your brand, what resonates with your brand, and what supports, that perspective that is really inherent to your brand. But in your opinion, what do you think actually captivates the audience best? I mean, is there merit to taking the we're crazy lab coat wearing mad scientists, uber snooty coffee pro type, take that shtick? Or do you feel like a more relaxed and kind of easygoing approach is more palatable when it comes to really engaging, the prospective wholesale clients?
Well, I see value in both styles. Personally, I'm more a fan of the relaxed, here are the standards and they're real and they're scientifically based, but it's presented in this is also like cooking, and there's some relaxation to it and fun, and there's some art to it, but there is a background of science behind what you're doing. I think that's easier to train a wide swath of people. I don't think it's off-putting. It may be off-putting to somebody who's very, uptight and wants everything exact. That person may struggle in that type of a program versus the, and I've seen the Uber lab training, the people that love data and getting things exact, it's like music to their ears. For everybody else, it's grating and it's off-putting, to say it mildly. And I think you lose people much more in that type of a program, because people that are turned off by that super stiff training they're not going to absorb the information. They're just not going to care. And I think if you had the relaxed training program and somebody is craving more hard science, hard data, you can introduce that to them in that same casual way. You can satisfy their need to, why are you recommending 15 times water to coffee ratio? Why not 14? Why not 16? And that you could explain that would satisfy that need. Why are you recommending, a 202 degree water, 198 versus, 215? That you can explain, what happens to the brew when you go up to that temperature. I think you could still, cater to that. But if you're running this stiff training program and somebody's saying, what if I wanted to try, pouring a monk's head versus, a leaf pattern, or if I want to free form it, and they're like, no, this is the way we want it done, and it has to be done in this way for teaching latte art. We're just doing hearts, or we're just doing, leaf patterns. I just think that people that are craving more of an artistic and culinary experience are going to be left cold on that.
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I don't think you need to be so absorbed in coffee science that it alienates the vast majority of your potential customers. In fact, I think it's, counter to your economic interests.
Right.
But great training programs are really able to essentially engage what, how, and why, right? At the simplest level,
Right.
where you start with, what are we doing here? I'm just getting a job. I just got hired to this coffee program. I may or may not drink the stuff. I may or may not have an idea about what goes into it. And I may or may not be open to thinking further about it, right? And so the easiest way to get the most from a training session is well, hey, we are going to make great coffee. That is our what. And that may entail these steps, right? And that transitions us to how. Here is how we are going to make great coffee. This is what it is definitively. It's measurable. It's simple. It's like a great mission statement, 5 words or less, something that you can internalize and take away. And as someone who is new to the trade, I can make it mine. I can know how to do it. And then if and when someone really wants to take a next step, you can load things with why, right?
Sure.
And your team should be absolutely prepared. This is like the great footnote in like just a meaty paragraph in, fantastic writing,
Right.
Where you're like, this is, nonfiction, informative writing. And you're just like, oh my gosh, that sentence is so loaded. You follow it down, you see where it's coming from. And it's just this absolute nerd out on whatever it is, you're digging into. But it's not the type of thing that you just dump on someone where they are all of a sudden having to drink water from a fire hose, on some rant about extraction percentages in this thing. And, I've made the mistake of doing that so many times for my own self-indulgence and realized that there's just little to no return there. And often, you're essentially turning off someone that could otherwise fall in love with what they might be doing, even if it's a fleeting thing, even if it's a seasonal thing for them.
Sure.
But yeah, beyond that, I think, there's plenty of room, doing, focusing on the what, how, and why, specialty coffee from your company's approach, whether you, have a really rigid classroom style or a, workshopy, super active, kind of fun and kinetic approach, or you have the kind of, hey, welcome to the physics lab,
Right.
Type of approach. You can really stylize it in any way
Sure.
as long as those are your priorities.
Yeah, it can be about your personal flavor at that point.
For sure.
Right.
I guess, so, transitioning to our last sort of major consideration, the question begs to be asked. We've talked about standardization. You've certainly brought up that, back when you were developing your training program, and I can certainly attest, I've long been involved in SCA, SCAA prior, standard development and training, and have certainly carried those back to the respective companies that I've been working for and training at the time, and I couldn't appreciate more or champion more the idea of industry-wide standards.
Right.
But I think we'd be remiss not to bring up the question. Well, is it in the best interest of any given roaster in their training programs to calibrate with these industry-wide standards? Why do it? Why don't do it? And if you're going to not do it, what should you consider for, where to find yourself and where to find the things that you're going to then, go out into the marketplace and say, we'll do it this way.
Yeah, it's a tough one because I'm a firm believer in the standards that were created by the SCA/SCAA or SCAE for our European listeners. They were built with thinking behind them, and they have been tested throughout the years. And there's the good thing about them is it's not it's this only. There's a scale, Gold Cup, for example. There's a range of where this fits in there. And then I think there within those limits are where you could find your individual expression of your product. But I have seen roasters. I was a judge in a competition that was clearly stated it was going to use the SCAA cupping form and it was going to it was a brewing. It was going to use the Roasters Guild brewing standards, and I had a roaster say, "Well, we don't use any of that stuff. We've created our own standards, which are far superior, and we want our coffees judged on these parameters. And we're not going to, we don't care about, that group that their standards are garbage." And it takes a lot of arrogance to say that and then come in and not deliver on anything unique, new, or better. I think if you're going to go it alone, you better have it well thought out why you're doing that. And you better be able to approve beyond a shadow of a doubt that your method actually produces a better cup of coffee for your roasted coffee. And you may have that. I've yet to see it. I've yet to see somebody create a standard that's better than. I've seen deviations from the existing standards that do work, but not just, I'm going it alone, I'm a maverick here, and this is what I believe. I've yet to see that play out.
Sure. Yeah, no, if anything, I mean, I think the backup for bucking the industry-wide standards is just that you found a tighter target within it, right?
Yeah, that's
saying,
fine. But...
well, for this particular coffee, we're going to work within this. I've never found, I mean, to me, the greatest opportunity you're offering a trainee in this context when you do embrace the standards is for them to find themselves in this wider picture, right?
Yeah.
And to find place. And, that sounds real meta and sort of like, feely, but and it is. But I think also you stand to substantiate your point of view in a way that I don't think you can do to someone when they're looking at you like, okay, cool, hey, you're here to tell me what to do, and I may be new to this entire thing, I may not, but either way, when there's hey, here's the broader picture, this is how coffee is brewed in general, this is right. Useful no matter where you take it, and this is a fail-safe to fall back on in any case or question. There's tremendous value there. I think what works when companies are essentially taking a position otherwise is they're they might have already been well versed in these standards and decided, well, for our washed Kenya AA XYZ coffee, we brew it this way and we do this particular variance because we believe this actually sharpens the acidity and refines the focus of the cup, and this is exactly what we want you to do in this context.
And I think that is perfectly fine to do. But I think, like, even using art as a comparison, Jackson Pollock learned how to draw figure drawing and different disciplines to become an accomplished artist before he went into his own style. So you need that base, you need to have the fundamentals down to understand why you're going to deviate, and then you're able to communicate that deviation and prove that deviation. And I'm all for that. I mean, I think that in some cases in espresso, the argument of temperature stability, has still kind of bandied about in the brewing circles. Kevin Knox, for years, Kevin Knox of Starbucks and Allegro Coffee, fantastic coffee mentor of mine, was adamant that cone brewing was far inferior to brewing on a flat bed. And Nick Cho actually, picked up on that and believed in that when he was, working with Kalita cones, and then he created his own December dripper with this flatbed idea. And then later, I read some scientific paper that no, cone brewing actually can be superior. And so, in that, the standards are being tested and challenged all the time. Kevin's reasoning for his belief back in the day made sense, but over time and being tested, there was some flaws in that theory. Now he's probably going to write and want to kill me after saying this, and that's perfectly fine. I'll accept the challenge, but I believe that it has been proven that just flatbed brewing is not necessarily superior to brewing with a more conical shape. And, same with espresso. Temperature stability, people have argued whether that's important, or temperature surfing, where you can temperature surf with certain group heads. And then you look at the changes in pressure that has recently developed, where people are changing the amount of pressure happening during the brewing process. And to me, I always compared that to a lever machine. The spring is actually changing the pressure as it's activated. Isn't that the same thing? So yeah, there's a lot of wiggle room in there where the standards, they don't cover everything. And there's a point that you need to still experiment and perfect your method, but I still think you need the fundamentals in place to do that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the greatest, for anyone who, say you're a small growing roaster and you have no background in coffee brewing whatsoever.
Yeah.
Your interest was, hey, I roasted coffee. People thought it was good. I'm going to grow the company. There is a huge amount of value in getting involved in these wider industry in wider industry focused training events, through SCA and otherwise, that will give you the perspective of a broad industry fed, brewing standard. That additionally, even if you are well versed, attending these, getting involved, investing in them is a tremendous opportunity around hearing how other people communicate and teach, rolling in different strategies, different tools, mechanisms. To me, to go out and to take classes, maybe that I didn't need any sort of technical piece from, but to actually just kind of absorb how someone else communicated the same information, or even, what types of activities they employed for, an applied part of the session. This was amazing. And I think that, you shouldn't undervalue getting out there, even in the context that you already know what you're doing, you already know your standards. There's a lot to be gotten from, getting involved in these industry programs, just to refine how you're going to teach, even if you're not necessarily reconsidering what you're going to teach. So, that's huge. But, to give a quick recap for everyone, we have industry standards or otherwise, where to find ourselves within this. We have, the communication style and almost, let's say, quote unquote, treatment of the program, lab, informal, how you're presenting and the whole marketing style and how that jives with your coffee brand. We have the value of your trainer, team structure, and how you look at that within your actual roasting company. And of course, distribution, whether by training center, whether in the field with your customer, monetizing, selling direct to consumer. We've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
What do you think? Any loose ends we need to tie as we sort of come into the end of the coffee roaster and customer training here, Mark?
I think the main loose end is that you have to take training seriously as a company. You cannot get by with A, not doing it, and B, doing it half-heartedly. This is something as important as developing your own staff if you have a retail environment, if you want your brand to translate outside of your own control, which would be your wholesale clientele. I cannot emphasize it enough, the amount of weight and importance and effort and resources you need to throw at this to do it right. And if you are able to do it right, it will be the difference between an incredibly successful wholesale program and a lackluster one.
Absolutely. And beyond just taking it seriously, I think, the to really substantiate that seriousness, you also, as a primary, even as someone who, you might even be a part of just the business structure.
Sure.
And you're thinking about this and you're like, well, it's so great that I have so-and-so to care about this for me. But, you really need to show and set a tone from the top down, or in my, in what I presented in our last set of episodes, that from the bottom up, right? The inverse hierarchy, or the inverse triangle, in terms of structure. You really need to set that tone of like, this matters. You should be going through these trainings. You should be, championing these standards, even as you brew a cup of coffee, as you're seen in your roastery. If you care about standardization and methodology in terms of how your customers brew, this should be something that, everybody in your organization cares about and is exploring, even just in sort of the respiration of the business day to day.
You've been listening to The X-Files, revisiting, rewinding, reworking episodes of the Exchange Coffee podcast from the past, hosted by Mark Inman and Todd Mackey, and produced by me, Mike Ferguson. Our free use opening theme for this episode was X-Files UK Drum Beat by Ronnie Drake. Our closing theme is Coffee Shop Acoustic Funk by Nick Panic. Black Coffee is performed by the one and only Ella Fitzgerald. Remember, you can always email me at mike.ferguson@kavoya.com.
What's in your glass, Mark?
Well, what's in my glass, Todd, is nothing because I drank it all waiting for you.